Good morning. Now, Mr. McGregor, I think we're ready to recommence with Ms. Freeman.
Yes, Lord.
Good morning, Ms. Freeman.
Good morning.
As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McGregor, who's sitting opposite you. But first of all, you are agreeable to take the oath?
Yes, I am.
Right. Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Now, as probably been explained to you, we will be sitting between 10 and a lunch break at 1. We usually take a coffee break at about 11:30. But if at any stage you want to take a break for any reason, just give me an indication. Mr. McGregor.
You are Jeane Freeman, is that correct?
I am.
And you've provided 2 witness statements to the inquiry.
Yes.
Just for the benefit of core participants, the first statement is at pages 160 to 214 of Bundle 1 of the witness statements, and then the second witness statement is at pages 12 to 19 of Bundle 4 of the witness statements. Ms. Freeman, the witness statements will form part of your evidence to the inquiry, but you're also going to be asked some questions by me today. Copies of your statements should be available, so if you do want to refer to them at any point, please just do let me know. If there's any documents that I wish to take you to, those should come up on the big screen in front of you. If for any reason you can't see them or can't see the part of the document I'm referring to, please just do let me know.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin just by asking you some questions about your qualifications and work history, which are set out within your statement. You'll appreciate that really for the purposes of today, it's really the period of your career where you were the former Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport that the inquiry is interested in. But before that, am I correct in thinking you trained as a nurse initially?
I did, yes.
You joined the civil service in 2000?
Yes.
You were appointed to the board of the National Waiting Times Centre, a special health board that runs the Golden Jubilee National Hospital in 2008, is that correct?
Yes.
And in 2011, you were appointed as chair of that board?
Yes.
So in addition to your experience as former Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, you also have relevant experience as the chair of a health board for a period of time?
I do.
And again, we'll come on and perhaps chat through some of the detail of that, but how relevant was that experience whenever you were coming to make some of the decisions in relation to the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences?
Well, it certainly formed part of the experience that I brought to that decision-making because Golden Jubilee Foundation is a national board, so it offers services across the whole of Scotland. And that means that there is an interrelationship with the territorial boards. For example, NHS Lothian is one. So I was familiar with the work of territorial boards and the work of my colleague chairs from those boards, as well as the work I did as myself with Golden Jubilee.
Thank you. And you stepped down from the board in 2016 when you were elected as a member of the Scottish Parliament, is that right?
Yes.
And you were the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport between 2018 and 2021, is that
Yes.
correct? And again, perhaps just to reference matters in terms of what I'll call the project, the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences. At the point that you're appointed as Cabinet Secretary, the project agreement has already been entered into and there's detailed construction works that have already taken place. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. In terms of your evidence today, there's really 6 matters that I'd like to explore with you. The first is really just to ask you some general matters about the project. The second issue would be to discuss a timeline in decision making up to the 4th of July when you make the decision not to open the hospital. The third issue would then be to look at some of the problems with the project and why the hospital couldn't open. Fourthly, then to look at remedial works and the decision to open the hospital. And then topics 5 and 6 would be to ask for some of your views on NHS Scotland Assure, the Centre for Excellence, and then any other reflections that you have on the project. So we'll deal with some general matters and then look at some specific matters thereafter. So in terms of general matters, in your position as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, you explain within your statement that that would be a strategic leadership role. It's about holding boards to account, but the overriding responsibility is to ensure the safe and effective delivery of health and social care in Scotland. Is that right?
That's correct.
And within your statement, I won't take you to it at the minute, but at page 167 on paragraph 26, you describe health boards as being the delivery arm of the NHS. Could you perhaps just explain to the inquiry, what do you mean by that? How is there a division between the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government on the one hand and the health boards on the other?
So the Scottish Government, through the Cabinet Secretary for Health, sets the strategic direction for the NHS in Scotland and makes decisions about the overall resourcing of those. You don't do that in isolation. You do that with input from your clinical advisors and indeed from our Royal Colleges and our healthcare unions and the views of particularly board chief executives. But you set the overall strategic direction. Your responsibility is then to resource that as best you can. And it is the job of health boards, whether they're territorial or national, to deliver against that overall strategic direction. But they also have a responsibility to be able to deliver what is being asked of them in the knowledge of the local circumstances of the area that they are responsible for. So, for example, you would expect the delivery of a particular area of healthcare, perhaps primary care, perhaps specialist care, to be different in an area like NHS Highlands, where not only the population, but the spread of population, the distances between areas of population is significantly different from what you might find in the Central Belt. The same would be true of Dumfries and Galloway or the Borders. So they need to understand their local area and the opportunities and constraints that that poses, and look to ensure that how they deliver makes sense for their own area. So they might not all do it the same way, but they should all be pointing in the same direction, if you like.
Thank you. And in terms of major projects, if we're thinking about a major new build hospital, what's the division between the involvement of central government as opposed to the health board?
So the health board is the statutory body responsible for the delivery of a build project. It will identify where it believes one is needed, put together the argument to support that, and approach Scottish Government for agreement on, if you like, its business case, and therefore the funding resource that is likely to be required. And it will argue, as any health board should, that its particular project is important and try and argue to have agreement for it to go ahead in an early round of capital funding, where there is the option of capital funding through, I think it was being referred to earlier in the inquiry as treasury funding through government. Now, in getting to that point, the board will have had a number of discussions with officials in the Health Directorate, partly around whether capital funding is an option, and if not, what the alternatives might be. They will involve Scottish Futures Trust in that, in looking at what other funding options there might be. But they are in the lead for that. And government's job and the Cabinet Secretary's job is to determine whether the case for that new facility is made and whether or not there is a sufficient resource package there to allow that to happen. But the Health Board is the lead body, the statutory lead body.
Thank you. And if I could perhaps just ask you to look to your statement, please, which is in bundle 1 of the witness statements, to page 166 and to paragraph 23. So page 166, paragraph 23. You see the sentence beginning, as Cabinet Secretary, do you see that? Mm-hmm. So you tell the inquiry, as Cabinet Secretary, the starting point in relation to any NHS project was for me to be assured at the highest level that projects being run by the Health Board were progressing on time and within budget. It is not the role of a Cabinet Secretary, generally speaking, to be involved in the day-to-day progress and decision-making on any project commissioned and being managed by a local health board. Do you see that?
Yes.
So if the project has been approved for funding and is on time and on budget, is it very much a hands-off role from central government?
Yes, it is. The government would expect to be kept up to date with how it is progressing, and certainly to be alerted to any particular issues, either in terms of the financial envelope that's been agreed or glitches in the progress against the timeline.
And how serious does an issue have to be with a project before it would be escalated, not just to civil servants within the Scottish Government, but right up to the Cabinet Secretary?
So an example of that would be there was a point not long after I was appointed as Health Secretary where I was briefed to a situation with this particular project and the board where there was a possibility of court proceedings. So that obviously then, that's an indication of a level of seriousness that would mean something would be, I would be alerted to it. I'm then, with all the background to that and so on, and I'm then kept up to date with whether or not a resolution, as happened in this case, could be found.
So if we think about a project that there is some form of trouble or some form of distress, once it comes onto the radar of Scottish Government and potentially the Cabinet Secretary, how involved would the Scottish Government be at that point? Is it simply wanting to keep a watching brief on things, or would there be direct involvement from that point onwards, or does it simply depend?
I think it depends. As a Cabinet Secretary, you are reliant on the judgment of your senior officials in the Health Directorate, most importantly the Chief Operating Officer, but also your Director General, as to whether or not, A, to alert you to an issue, and B, to then offer a view and advice as to whether or not they think government should be more directly involved. Now, there will be direct involvement, for example, if there is a financial issue, or as I just explained, the possibility of court proceedings between a board and another party. But you are reliant on that advice, and oftentimes what you're being told is that you don't need to do anything as a Cabinet Secretary, but you need to know what your officials are doing. And they may be pointing a board or advising a board to approach Scottish Futures Trust or Health Protection Scotland, or one of the other bodies that has expertise and advice.
And if we just think to the role of the Cabinet Secretary, there's a project whereby there's a problem, it's in some form of distress. Am I right in thinking that you would be wanting some form of assurance that that project is taking steps to get back on track?
Oh, absolutely. Because in all of this, of course, what we have to remember is that as Cabinet Secretary, I am accountable through the Scottish Parliament to people in Scotland for the safe and effective delivery of healthcare. So, whilst it may be the case on occasion that officials advise me of a situation and advise me about what they're doing, that doesn't mean that I am a passive recipient of that advice. I may ask them to do something in addition to what they're suggesting. I may talk to them about whether or not I should intervene, even if that is only to raise the matter directly with the chair of the board, whom I or my predecessor will have appointed. So the Cabinet Secretary is not a passive recipient of this information, even if they do not have a direct, or they do not decide to directly intervene.
So if there's a problem that arises, there'd have to be a solution and some form of assurance provided to Scottish Government and Cabinet Secretary before the project can go further down the line.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd now like to just ask you some general questions about the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences. We'll come on to the detail later in your evidence, but the hospital doesn't open as planned on the 9th of July 2019. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's because you take a decision on the 4th of July that it shouldn't open. Is that correct?
Correct.
If I could ask you to look to your witness statement, please. So bundle 1, page 176, and to paragraph 52. So you tell the inquiry, we were aware that in the background there were issues with the QEUH, but primarily it was about patient safety. Do you see that?
I do.
So could you just explain in broad terms, why did you determine that the hospital couldn't open?
Because I could not be assured that it would be a safe environment to put patients and staff into, not only because of the issue around ventilation that had been raised with me, but also given that we were being advised of that so late in the day, with very few days before the planned opening, then I was anxious about whether or not there were any other areas, critical areas, to effective functioning of a hospital environment that might also not be meeting standards.
So concerns about ventilation, but it's not just concerns about ventilation. You've got the concerns about ventilation, but at this point you're thinking, are there other things that are wrong with that hospital? Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think reasonably, if you're told on the 4th of July that there is, or you're told on the 2nd of July, that there is a critical issue with ventilation in critical care and in critical care at that point, subsequently wider, but in critical care, and the hospital is due to open to much fanfare on the 9th of July, I think it is reasonable to say, well, what else don't we know? And if that bit's not safe, then how can we be sure that any other part is safe and has met, and by that I mean has met standards? Mm-hmm. And the point about in the background there were issues with, I was aware, there were issues with the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, was my knowledge of the problem of trying to fix an important matter that relates directly to infection prevention and control, whilst you have patients in situ, and the risks that that in itself carries.
So you've got the embedded knowledge from the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. Yeah. A hospital opens and then you try to retrofit it, yeah, and you know that that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. You're told that there's issues with the critical care rooms, but you're saying it's not just about critical care. But in terms of the critical care rooms itself, I'd just like to understand what your thought process was at the time. Was your position that the critical care rooms weren't safe, the ventilation system was not safe for patients to enter?
Yes, that was my position. My understanding was that the air change was 4 per hour and the standard requires 10 per hour. So we weren't even halfway there.
So again, just so I'm understanding things, the guidance which we'll come on to talk about, Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301 says 10 air changes per hour for critical care. The testing shows that it's 4 air changes per hour. Your understanding as Cabinet Secretary was it doesn't comply with the standard, and if it doesn't comply with the standard, it's not safe. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in relation to the guidance, Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, The inquiry's heard a lot of evidence that it's just guidance. This wasn't a hard-edged legal standard set out in a set of regulations like the building regulations. At this point in time, were you surprised that that type of information that you attributed to patient safety was simply set out in a guidance document as opposed to some form of hard-edged legal standard?
Not especially, although in truth I'm not conscious that I worried about that in particular. As far as I was concerned, the guidance is produced by people who are expert in the field for which the guidance addresses. And if you have that guidance, it's advising you of best practice, why would you not then follow that? Whether it is mandatory or not, why would you not do that? And how could you possibly justify not doing it?
So again, just so I'm understanding, Matt, is this really a policy decision on the part of Scottish Government and yourself as Cabinet Secretary that you have the published guidance that sets standards and that patients in Scotland are entitled to expect that they would be treated in a new build hospital that complied with the guidance that sets up-to-date safety standards?
That's correct, yes.
And again, should the inquiry understand that if there was a new build hospital that didn't comply with those standards, the Scottish Government would want that hospital to be retrofitted so that it did comply with that standard?
We would want the compliance with the standard fixed. Now, whether that is retrofit or whether that is resolved and improved to standard before the new build opens depends on what's involved in fixing whatever the problem is to meet the guidance.
And again, just so I'm understanding things, that's because I think, as you said earlier in your evidence, when we're talking about the guidance, yes, it's just guidance, but really in your position as Cabinet Secretary, you are equating compliance with the guidance with a safe hospital.
Yes, I am. And that is partly because, as I've said, guidance is drafted by those who are expert in the area that the guidance addresses. I'm a Cabinet Secretary. I'm not an expert in infection prevention and control. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a construction expert. So it is important that I pay attention to the expertise in the relevant field and don't try and gainsay it.
Thank you. The final, just general, very broad question that I would ask you at the outset of your evidence. You have this project which is late, over budget, all the implications that come with that. What went wrong so that the hospital didn't open on time and on budget?
So my understanding from the reports from both KPMG and NSS that I commissioned is that the root here is a human error in between the specification and the environmental matrix that was not then picked up subsequently at any of the points where it might have been identified and fixed. So the mistake was bedded in then. And it was not until the very last minute when the ventilation was tested that the problem was discovered.
So your understanding, given all the reports that have been done, investigations that you'll have undertaken, is there's a human error right at the start of the project that effectively gets hardwired in and just isn't spotted at the various stages through the project. Is that right?
Yes. So, and it isn't spotted at various stages of the project is actually an important point. So we're looking at a situation where a mistake is made, and human beings make mistakes, but the point of governance, which is about scrutiny and challenge, is to, amongst other things, to identify where mistakes might have been made and through scrutiny and constructive challenge, address those and resolve them. So in my view, that process also did not work.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'd be interested in your views. the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence that NHS Lothian didn't have the technical skills in-house to try to manage this type of project. So they have lead technical advisors, engineers that get appointed externally. They have a set governance procedure that complies fully with the Scottish Capital Investment Manual. Standing back from matters, how did it come to be that none of the advisors spot any of these issues and none of the governance structures spot these issues?
So in terms of the advisors, I can't comment on that. I'm sure that you will have addressed those relevant questions to them. In terms of the governance, there is an issue around governance, and that is, in my opinion, and that is you can have governance structures. So you can have the bit of paper that sets out very clearly which committee is where and who does it report to and so on. But governance is a proactive exercise. Governance requires to be a verb as well as a descriptor. So if in your governance structures, those responsible are not questioning, or you do not have all of the expertise into that governance structure that you need, then the risk is that you miss important matters, and they, as we've said, just become bedded in. Now, NHS Lothian, as you've said, had advisors and technical expertise, but in-house, they also have expertise in infection prevention and control. They have very senior, very well-respected, very experienced clinicians who know what they expect if they are working in a critical care unit, and they expect the standard of 10 changes per hour to be met. So you have to involve those individuals in the design and the governance of delivery in the same way as you involve engineers, construction experts, whatever else it might be.
Thank you. I'd now like to move on to the second broad topic that I'd like to explore with you today, and that's really a timeline and decision making, considering the period really from 2018, whenever you come into office, right up until the 4th of July 2019. Before you get appointed as Cabinet Secretary, there is an ongoing dispute between NHS Lothian on the one hand and the project company and its subcontractor Multiplex on the other. And it's about approximately 20 rooms and primarily about what the pressure regime should be in those rooms. Should it be balanced or negative pressure, or should it be positive pressure? Whenever you are appointed as Cabinet Secretary, does this come onto your radar? Are you briefed about this ongoing dispute?
So I am briefed about that ongoing dispute, and that's what I referred to earlier, where at the point where I was briefed, there was a possibility, if no resolution could be found, that there would be court action. And so part of the rationale, I mean, I would be briefed in becoming Cabinet Secretary on a range of different running matters, if you like, across health and social care. But in this particular instance, it was focused around the dispute and the options at that point, either a resolution or there would be court proceedings.
And if there was going to be court proceedings, would those have to be, albeit they would be in the name of NHS Lothian, would they have to be raised with the knowledge and approval of the Cabinet Secretary?
No, they would not require approval of the Cabinet Secretary because NHS Lothian is a statutory body responsible for the build, for that project. I would expect them to be raised with the knowledge of the Cabinet Secretary, but a Cabinet Secretary would not be asked to approve that.
Okay. If I could perhaps just ask you to look to a briefing note that was made available on the 9th of October 2019. So that's bundle 8, page 109. So bundle 8, page 109. It was a briefing note for a staff side meeting, but there's quite a bit of embedded background documentation in relation to that briefing. If I could ask you to look on to page 119, please. And it's to the timeline of briefings, which are actually, these are briefings that take place slightly before you come into office, I think in the summer of 2018. And you'll see approximately in the middle of the page, there's an entry for the 21st of March 2018. Do you see that?
Yes.
Where it says briefing to Cabinet Secretary, which would be the previous Cabinet Secretary, noting that court action would need to be approved by CS before it starts. Do you see that?
I do.
But your understanding is that that's not technically correct, that NHS Lothian could litigate without the approval of the Scottish Government?
Yes, that would be my understanding. And the reason I have that understanding is because of a situation with Greater Glasgow and Clyde on a completely different matter, nothing to do with a build, but to do with mental health, actually, where that health board was considering court action, and it was not my job to approve it. So that's the basis on which I do not believe it would be the Cabinet Secretary's job to approve it, unless there was additional financial pressures as a consequence of that, which the board did not believe they could meet themselves within their budget.
Thank you. The inquiry's heard a lot of evidence about this dispute and how it comes to be resolved. The broad thrust of the evidence before the inquiry is that there is a principals meeting that takes place in the February of 2018 that doesn't resolve matters. There's the possibility of litigation in March, April. There's discussions that continue. It's not clear when there's actual agreement that's reached, but approximately summer 2018, at which point project company and their subcontractor Multiplex carry out the works to achieve balanced or negative pressure, albeit the formal agreement, the settlement agreement, isn't signed until the February of 2019. Is that your understanding of the chronology of events?
It is. And that agreement, of course, required approval from government because it required additional funds.
Mm-hmm. And could you just explain to the inquiry, in that period through late 2018 up to the point that the agreement is signed and the funding is put in place by the Scottish Government, what's your involvement in relation to that process?
I don't really have any involvement in relation to that process. Given that the board is a statutory body, agreement has been reached. My involvement, if any, is to understand from Health Finance what the impact might be of additional funds being made to NHS Lothian to pay for the settlement, if you like, and what the impact of that will be on the rest of the health budget. In other words, what might we not be doing now because we need to put money in that direction?
Okay. And what assurances, if any, would you be seeking as Cabinet Secretary that this was a good deal that was going to get matters back on track?
So I would look for, assurances that exactly that was worth spending that money on. And those assurances would come in largely by saying, well, the alternative is court action, which will produce delays, potentially cost significantly more money. And so a resolution is always better than going down that route. The detail of the resolution, I would not expect to know, but I would assume that the board as a statutory body with all its responsibilities for the build would ensure that the resolution allowed the build to progress to the required specification.
Okay. So when we're talking about assurances being provided to the Scottish Government and to the Cabinet Secretary, if the Health Board is saying we've reached a deal and matters are going to get back on track, you would simply assume that should be taken as read, that it will resolve the dispute?
Yes, now, government officials will have a lot more detail behind that, but there really isn't any point in having a health board as a statutory body responsible for a build if you are not going to trust that they are able to meet the responsibilities placed on them. And when they give you that assurance at the highest level in the health board, which would be the chief executive, who themselves you assume has been assured of the matter, then it is reasonable to trust in their judgment.
You don't think that's problematic when a project's in distress, that a health board has already got into problems, and they then simply say, we need more money and we've reached a resolution and it's all going to be fine? You don't think at that point central government should be asking for more in the way of assurances?
So I don't think it was quite as you've categorised it. I think the health board would argue that the dispute was not solely of their making, and that they needed to resolve that with the project company and then through them with the contractors, and that when they come back and say, we have now reached a resolution on these matters in detail, but we need additional funds from Scottish Government, then Health Finance in Scottish Government would be looking at why do you need extra money, what's it for, and what areas of resolution, is there anything outstanding? So they would have those assurances, and their advice to me, or their briefing to me, would be a satisfactory resolution has been reached.
Do you think at this point, before the settlement agreement was reached with changes to the technical specification, that Health Facilities Scotland should have been instructed to review the technical solution contained within the agreement?
Well, I think if NHS Lothian did not ask Health Facilities Scotland to review that, then that's a miss.
So if there hasn't been a review by Health Facilities Scotland, that's a miss as you describe it?
Well, as I understand it, that settlement agreement involved derogation from standards. Now, I would have expected derogation from standard to be advised to Scottish Government. My understanding is that that was not the case. And I'm confident it wasn't the case because that would have come to me. And again, there would have been an opportunity at that point to intervene, certainly before more public funds were used. But the board did not advise Scottish Government of that. And again, as I understand it, did not seek Health Facilities Scotland's input.
Yes. I won't take you to your statement, but just for the Chair's notes, at page 169, at paragraph 30, you make the point that you weren't aware that Settlement Agreement 1 involved compromises to the ventilation system or any deviation from normal guidance. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I am confident that Scottish Government was not aware.
Were you aware that in terms of the negotiation of the settlement agreement, that there was no involvement from the lead infection prevention and control doctor or the lead infection prevention and control nurse at NHS Lothian?
No, I'm not. I would have expected such involvement.
So does that surprise you that there wasn't that infection prevention and control input onto a revision to technical solution for a system in critical care areas?
It does surprise me, and I think it is a mistake. Any built environment that is there to deliver healthcare should have all necessary and appropriate measures for infection prevention and control built in from design all the way through.
And do you think Scottish Government should have checked whether there was infection prevention and control input, or is that back to the point that you made earlier, that as Cabinet Secretary you need to trust the health boards to get on with delivering these projects?
So that was the situation, is exactly as you've described. I know we will come on to NHS Scotland Assure later in this session. But part of my thinking about why we needed such a body was precisely to ensure that infection prevention and control is baked into the design, the business case, the construction, the assurance of standards and the delivery of healthcare.
Thank you. Were you aware whenever Settlement Agreement 1 was being approved in the February of 2019 that it involved the building being accepted and handed over to NHS Lothian with the stage payments, the £1.4 million per month, starting immediately when the agreement was signed?
Yes, I was aware of that, yeah.
And why was the view taken that that was appropriate?
My understanding is that that was part of the agreement, that the remediation that was agreed in the settlement agreement was accepted by the board as constituting appropriate handover. And of course, at handover, they then become liable for the payments.
One of the areas that the inquiry's heard quite a lot of evidence about is a procedure called the high scribe procedure. Have you heard of that? Perhaps
yes.
After the event at some point. And the way it was explained to the inquiry by Dr. Inverarity, the lead infection prevention control doctor at NHS Lothian, was that he had no involvement in the settlement agreement. He simply found out by an all-staff email that the building had been accepted, NHS Lothian had accepted it. And he was extremely concerned at that point because what he described as the stage 4 high scribe check hadn't been completed before the building was accepted. And his evidence was that the stage 4 high scribe check is effectively the final safety check, and it should be carried out before a health board accepts a hospital. If you don't do it, you don't know that the hospital that you're accepting is safe. Do you remember any discussions taking place around about Settlement Agreement 1 as to whether the stage 4 high scribe would simply either be skipped or pushed down the road?
I don't recall that, although what you've recounted, Dr. Inverarity said, makes perfect sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Again, it might seem surprising to a layperson that the Scottish Government is providing funding for a settlement agreement which involves a new build hospital being accepted at a point where the stage 4 high scribe hasn't been completed. How did that happen?
Well, firstly, I don't know whether or not Scottish Government knew that the stage 4 high scribe had not been completed. And I go back to the point that the Health Board is a statutory body responsible for this building. And so it is reasonable to expect that they have gone through all the necessary steps.
Is that not something the Scottish Government should be checking, though, saying you're accepting the building and we're giving you the money for it? Have you followed and completed the stage 4 high scribe? Should Scottish Government not want that check or balance before they provide the money to the Health Board?
So, one part of me agrees that that should be the case. But there is an argument put that for Scottish Government to take on that role is to compromise the legal standing of a health board and the statutory responsibilities and roles that it has. That is a bigger question across a number of areas than simply in this case. And I think it is a legitimate area for future discussion.
And again, I think this is something you pick up towards the end of your statement, but it would be helpful to understand your thought process, both as someone who has sat on a board and also someone who has held office as Cabinet Secretary. But you have a project that by this point is in some distress. You've mentioned that there would come a point in a distress project where Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary may need to take a more active role. Could you just explain why you thought in this particular project the money could be handed over, but the Scottish Government didn't need to take that more granular role in the project and the approval processes?
I'm not sure that I did think that. That was the way it had always been done. The advice to me was, of course, because of the statutory nature of the board and therefore their responsibility for the build, it was entirely appropriate to assume, based on their assurances, that they had taken all the appropriate steps before they accepted handover. And the government's role in all of that was one step removed, and largely on the basis of financial arrangements. The monthly payments were already built in to NHS Lothian's budget, so there was no questioning around that. And if Scottish Government's position was, if the board was satisfied that it was prepared to accept handover, that was for the board to make that decision. There is, of course, an obvious follow-on question, which is, if you were starting from a blank sheet of paper, would you do it that way again? If I had that blank sheet of paper, no, I wouldn't.
So if you had that blank sheet of paper, what would you do to try to improve and tighten up those governance procedures?
So I think the establishment of NHS Scotland Assure was my attempt to walk the tightrope between the position of health boards in terms of their legal standing and statute and what I consider to be the responsibilities of Scottish Government and a Cabinet Secretary. So without throwing up in the air the legislation that underpins health boards, with all the furore and time that would involve, NHS Scotland Assure, in my mind, was the means by which Scottish Government could have independent of a health board, to a degree independent of Scottish Government, levels of assurance across a range of matters greater than had been the case up until that point.
Would you agree, looking back, that if the Scottish Government were going to fund a health board to the point that it was entering into a settlement agreement to accept a hospital and begin making the stage payments for the hospital, that it should in the future seek assurance that standard procedures, due process, including the high scribe process, were fully completed before that took place?
So I think what Scottish Government, in this particular instance and in others, sought assurance was that all probably framed, I mean, I don't know this, but it would probably be framed in terms of all required steps have been taken. And what you're suggesting is that we have a bit more granular detail behind that phrase. So the Scottish Government would have sought assurance all appropriate steps had been taken by the board. And if the answer to that is yes, then proceed. To have more granular detail behind that question, I think would be reasonable.
Thank you. The inquiry's heard quite a lot of evidence about the financial position of the project company IHSL in the period late 2018 to February 2019. The evidence indicates that the company was in a degree of financial distress, potentially looking at insolvency, because it was a project company set up that it had debt to fund, but none of the stage payments had started coming in. Do you remember any discussions taking place in relation to the financial position of the project company IHSL in the period late 2018 into early 2019?
None that involved me. That doesn't mean they weren't happening, but they did not involve me.
Okay. The reason I raise that is in submissions to the inquiry, NHS Lothian describes what happens in February 2019 as a bailout. It was money to bail out the project because the project company was on the verge of insolvency. It sounds from your evidence that you weren't aware of that type of analysis at the point that you were being briefed in early 2019.
No, I wasn't.
Does it surprise, if as a matter of fact the project company was staring down potential insolvency, does it surprise you that you weren't aware of that fact in either late 2018 or early 2019?
Yes.
And again, presumably it follows then that that's the type of issue that you would expect to be escalated, not just into Scottish Government, but right up to the Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it is a material factor, I would have thought, in the case to approve the additional funding to support the settlement.
So should the inquiry understand that once that settlement agreement is approved, the money moves, the stage payments are starting to be made, as far as you were concerned as Cabinet Secretary, this project was effectively back on track and it didn't at that stage need further direct involvement from Scottish Government?
As far as I was concerned, it was back on track, and I would expect my officials to continue to be kept up to date about its progress.
Thank you. Just at this stage, so we're not moving out of the sequencing in the chronology, NHS Lothian sought assurances from the project company in relation to compliance with published guidance, including SHTM 0301 in early 2019. I'll just ask you to look at that letter, please. It's in bundle 4, page 9. And it's a letter from IHSL to Brian Curry on the 31st of January 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
If we look over the page onto page 10, the reason that timing could be quite important is it's in sequencing before the settlement agreement is signed, but it's after the works have actually been completed in 2018. So the tweaks have been made to the ventilation system in 2018. This letter comes in early 2019, and then the settlement agreement is signed in the February. But there's not any material changes to the ventilation system after this letter is written. It's just the section on page 10. So in page 10, it states, all critical ventilation systems inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, ventilation for healthcare premises. Construction, all ventilation systems have been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required. Systems are maintained in such a manner which allows handover at actual completion to meet SHTM 0301 standards. Operations, all critical ventilation systems will be inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, ventilation for healthcare premises. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recall having seen this letter before?
No.
The reason I raise it, and it's perhaps looking at matters through the lens of whenever you used to sit on the National Waiting Time Centre Board, but also as Cabinet Secretary, it seems from this letter that NHS Lothian both sought and received assurances from the project company that the ventilation system as installed fully complied with SHTM 0301. From a governance perspective, we can talk about the granular level of detail on the project, but from a governance perspective, would you have expected NHS Lothian to do anything more than seek that type of assurance?
Well, it depends. I would have expected NHS Lothian to have independent assurance, not simply from the company itself.
And should that independent assurance have come before the settlement agreement or perhaps at a later stage before the hospital opens?
No, I think it should have come before the settlement agreement, because at that point you're accepting handover and you're accepting that the necessary steps have been taken. Now, you might have assurance, independent assurance of a number of issues and agreement that outstanding issues will be resolved following handover. That's possible. And then some caveat around the further issues to be resolved requiring independent assurance that they have been. So that's possible. I could see a situation where that might be a reasonable agreement to reach with the project company. But I would expect independent assurance.
And in terms of that independent assurance, the inquiry's heard evidence that the technical schedule to the settlement agreement, so the part that says balance and negative pressure, not positive pressure, that was drafted by NHS Lothian's lead technical advisors, Mott MacDonald. Would you have expected a further tier of independent assurance to have been provided to NHS Lothian, or do you think it would have been acceptable simply for them to rely on the external lead technical advisors that they'd engaged?
I think it would be reasonable for them to rely on the external advisors.
Thank you. I'd like to just focus on this time period again, sort of late 2018 into early 2019. Were you aware of potential issues emerging at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in relation to water and ventilation in this period?
Yes.
And again, this leg of the inquiry is to deal with the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences. So I will ask you some questions today about the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. That's really just to put in context decision-making in relation to the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People. The detail of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, what may or may not have been wrong with that hospital is for another day. But it's really just to understand what you were being told and what you understood as, let's just call them emerging issues at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. What was your understanding?
So my understanding, and I may not be, because I don't have the information in front of me, absolutely correct in terms of any timeline. But my understanding was that there were issues with the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in terms of water and whether or not the water and drainage systems were producing bacteria that could cause infection. That I think at that particular time, at the start, end of 2018, start of 2019, would be my understanding. Of course, subsequently, and I can't quite recall when exactly it happened, the situation at Queen Elizabeth with respect to pigeon droppings, when that occurred, and I visited the hospital, and then I became much more aware of all the detail around what were the issues there, what were the different views around that, and then subsequently around the situation with respect to the hemato-oncology unit and with children and young people.
Thank you. And perhaps just to put that in context, if I could ask you to look to bundle 4, please, page 8. Bundle 4, page 8. So bundle 4, page 8, please. This is a letter, Scottish Government headed letter paper on the 25th of January 2019, addressed to NHS Chief Executives, headed up Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, which begins following my call with you on Tuesday, 22 January, about the ongoing incident at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. Do you see that?
Yes.
A number of people have indicated that might be what you've referred to as the pigeon dropping incident.
It is.
And you see that there's a number of assurances that are sought. If we just look to the 4th bullet point, it says all critical ventilation systems should be inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, ventilation for healthcare premises. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, should the inquiry understand that at least by January 2019, there's emerging issues at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital of such seriousness that the Scottish Government wanted to seek assurances from other health boards in relation to compliance issues? Thank you. we can put that document to one side for the moment. I'd like to just pick up the main chronology of decision making. So that's the January-February settlement agreement signed. This matter seems to come back onto your radar on the 2nd of July 2019, is that correct?
Yes.
Just explain in your own words, what happens on the 2nd of July 2019? What are you being told at that point?
So I was told on the 2nd of July that there was a serious problem with the ventilation in the new hospital, where the standards required in certain parts of the hospital air changes of 10 per hour, and the tester had found that it was only 4.
And at this point in time, you tell us within the statement that, albeit this is early days and you're just being told, you already had very significant doubts as to whether the hospital could actually open a few days later on the 9th of July. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And again, just for the benefit of the Chair's notes, the issue of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, that this is now quite significant in the forefront of your mind. If I can ask you to look within your first statement, bundle 1 to page 173 and paragraph 40. So approximately 3 lines up from the bottom, so over the page onto page 173. We look to the 3 lines up from the bottom of paragraph 40, you'll see wording beginning, I also did not want. You see that?
Yes.
So you say, I also did not want a repeat of the QEUH, where you try to retrofix to fix something, and that potentially raises other issues around infection control. And then if we look on still within your statement to page 199. This time to paragraph 127. Approximately 4 lines down, you'll see a sentence beginning, I was clear that. You see that?
Yes.
You say, I was clear that as a lesson learned from the QEUH experience, I did not want major retrofitting going on once the hospital was occupied. Do you see that?
Yes.
Again, could you just perhaps explain, we've now moved on to the summer of 2019, and you've got concerns because there's retrofitting going on at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. What's happening at the other hospital in Glasgow at this point in time?
So there are at least 2 major problems with retrofitting, possibly 3. First of all, in order to do it, you often have to decant patients from where they are to an alternative. And when you're talking about critical care, you're talking about very sick patients, in this case, very sick children or young people, and you're moving them. So that's the first difficulty in terms of the quality of their experience. Not necessarily, not at all, in fact, the quality of care they're receiving from their clinical teams, but the quality of their experience and what the clinical teams have available to them to provide that care. Secondly, where you're talking about something like ventilation, then you are in effect pulling down in order to put back up. So you are producing dust, you're producing noise. Dust in particular carries a risk of airborne particles that may themselves be infectious, but if not, they will harm the quality of air in that hospital for any, be it patients or staff. And thirdly, retrofitting takes time because of all the constrictions of trying to have a building site in a place that is occupied. If we just think about even our own homes, while we continue to live there, if there is major construction work going on, it is restricted in how it goes about its business, but so too are our lives. Now, map that on to a hospital of very sick children and young people. That is not a situation you want to have if you can possibly avoid it.
Okay. So had you had the experience with the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital of trying to retrofit a hospital that is already opened, it's already treating patients, to try to bring that up to fully comply with published guidance? And you've told us that there's all these problems of trying to do that after the hospital's opened, and you wanted to avoid that for the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And also, I could not see how it would be possible to justify to those young patients or the patients at DCN or their families, far less the wider public, moving people into a new build that was not safe in terms, at least, of the ventilation. And of course, in addition, given how late we were being informed of this, I had questions about whether or not everything else that is important in a built environment was satisfactory and was meeting standards.
And I think you've very clearly explained in your evidence earlier today that certainly to your mind, you have the guidance. The guidance is equivalent of a bare minimum safety standard. So if you're not complying with the guidance, you're not providing a safe environment for patients. But had that thought process been reached, or at this point in time, the 2nd of July, was effectively the safety of the system as built, was that an unknown? Or from your perspective, because it didn't comply with the guidance, was it known that the hospital was not safe?
As far as I was concerned, it was known that the hospital wasn't safe in that respect. What was not known was whether it was safe in other respects.
Thank you.
And of course, the provision of safe and effective healthcare is not solely about the built environment, but it is a critical element to that, as I think the experience at Queen Elizabeth tells us.
Thank you. And if I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, please, Volume 1 and to page 37. You see that this is an email from Alan Morrison. It's the email towards the end where he says, please find attached a short briefing regarding an emerging issue with the new Edinburgh Children's Hospital. And then we see the briefing note over the page onto page 38. We see in the background section, if we pick matters up in the second last paragraph, it says a derogation was therefore agreed to reduce the air change rate from 6 to 4 times per hour in 14 out of the 4-bedded rooms. A settlement agreement was signed to that effect in November 2018. Included in that settlement agreement was specific reference to the Scottish Health Technical Memorandum, SHTM, Health Facilities Scotland. It specifies a standard of 10 air changes per hour for critical care beds. It's not yet clear if the contractor Multiplex has interpreted the derogation as overwriting SHTM specifications. It should be noted that there is a 0 rate of air change in critical care at the existing Royal Hospital for Sick Children. There are 19 critical care beds at RHSC. The new RHCYP has 24 critical care beds. Do you see that?
Yes.
So in terms of this issue of safety, you had the hospital at Sheen's that didn't have any mechanical ventilation, so it couldn't guarantee any particular air changes. And then you had the published guidance that said 10. You had this new hospital that had 4. A number of individuals that have given evidence to the inquiry have said that Sheen's was a safe hospital to treat children in, albeit it didn't have any mechanical ventilation. Were you having those types of discussions with clinicians or experts at either at this point in time or subsequently?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was, because it's not enough simply to think, well, the new hospital doesn't meet the standard, so we can't open it. You have to think about the consequences of that. There isn't a decision here that is risk-free. There is no option that is risk-free. So I'm looking at, well, if we don't open it, and at this point on the 2nd of July, 3rd of July, 4th, we don't know how long that might be the case. what is the situation, what is the assessment of the situation in the existing sick kids and in DCN. And of course, the reasonable advice that comes back is, well, neither of those two facilities are what we want, otherwise we wouldn't be building something new. But we know what the risks are there, and we know how to mitigate and manage those, and we have the data and the information to support that. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have a new build, not yet open, that in one critical area we know is not meeting the standard, which is a standard of best practice, and therefore cannot be considered to be safe.
Okay. So again, could you just perhaps help me? If Jeane's is safe, albeit has no mechanical ventilation, no air changes per hour, why was the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in the Department of Clinical Neurosciences, which had 4 air changes per hour in critical care, why was that unsafe?
Because it didn't meet the standard. I mean, Jeane's is a Victorian hospital that where it was not possible to insert mechanical ventilation without decanting the whole hospital. But the effective mitigations that have been put in place and the quality of the clinical care all produced evidence that it was a safe environment. You've got a new build that has taken some time to build, has cost a great deal of money, and in one critical area does not meet the standard now required in this decade. Why would you move people into that? From an environment which has proven itself, albeit without mechanical ventilation, but with high quality care, significant mitigation, and good infection prevention and control, why would you move people from that into one that is not meeting the standards that are required now to assist effective and safe care? And the alternative is that you move them in and then you try and fix it. And we've already covered the risks that carries. So I have a set of known risks, if you like, on the one hand, which is people stay where they are, patients stay where they are. And I have a set of unknown risks on the other.
Thank you. Still within the briefing note, if we could look to Bundle 7, Volume 1, over the page onto page 40. You see the bold heading, critical care, and it says an interim solution has been put forward by Multiplex to increase current 4 air change rates. So I won't read out all of option 1, but effectively there was one option that said for certain rooms they could be increased to 5.2 air changes. For some other rooms it could be increased to 7.1. But again, from the evidence you've given this morning, you should understand that from your perspective, none of those solutions would be acceptable because they're not meeting the standard in the guidance of 10 air changes per hour.
That's correct.
At the bottom of the page on this briefing note, you see that the heading 4, risk assessment. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
It says, our lead infection control doctor, consultant microbiologist Donald Inverarity advised that all air exchange rates are currently better than we have today, therefore will be in an improved position, but would wish external advice from HFS/HPS. He felt they were best to advise of risk running with less than 10. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recall any risk assessment being done or any advice being provided by HFS or HPS as to the specific risk of 4 air changes per hour as opposed to 10 air changes per hour?
Not directly to me, but of course my lead advisor in terms of infection prevention and control and in this area, or 2 lead advisors, were the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer. And they were clear that 10 was the required number of air changes.
Okay, so the advice that you're getting from the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer is the guidance says 10, so this new build hospital has to have 10 air changes per hour.
Yes.
So from that perspective, one might think at this point in time, you are a few days away from the hospital opening. You've got to make a decision. Perhaps understandable that no risk assessment's done at that point, but should the inquiry understand, really, from your perspective, there would be no point in doing a risk assessment thereafter if the chief medical officer and the chief nursing officer are telling you new build hospitals have to have 10 air changes per hour?
The standard is telling me that. The guidance drawn up by experts is telling me that. And my chief medical officer and my chief nursing officer are firmly of the view that the standard requires to be met. Now, as I've said, I'm not a clinician, I'm not an infection prevention and control expert, but I cannot see the point of dancing on the head of a pin about whether or not it is 7.1 or 6.2 when 10 is what is required. 10 is what is required, so we will have 10. But also, as I've said earlier, part of what is in my mind is, can I be confident that in terms of water, drainage, fire, any other critical matter to a built environment, that this hospital is currently meeting all the required standards except in ventilation? And of course, as we see subsequently, it was not.
Thank you. If I could ask you to move on, please, still within Bundle 7, Volume 1, and look to page 66. So Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 66. Presumably, as you tell us in the statement, in this period, 2nd, 3rd July, in addition to the emails that we'll look at, there's a flurry of meetings and discussions that are taking place, presumably some involving you, some involving your officials and NHS Lothian. Can you just explain in your own words, what was your understanding of NHS Lothian's position at this point in time? Did they want to simply open the hospital, or did they have concerns about patient safety if the hospital was just opened?
Oh no, they were taking it very seriously indeed and had concerns about patient safety. I think they were of the view that the hospital could not open on the 9th, and it was whether or not, what were the other options at that point.
Thank you. Because if we look within Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 66, this is an email from the Chief Executive of NHS Lothian to the Scottish Government. If we just pick matters up in the second paragraph beginning, it is worth reiterating. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. It says, it is worth reiterating that our guiding principle in dealing with this problem and all previous problems and delays associated with this building project has been to prioritise patient safety and only to commission services in the new building when we believed it was fully fit for purpose. Do you see that?
Yes.
So effectively, at this point in time, there seems to be a commonality in approach between both yourself and Scottish Government and NHS Lothian that the driving factor in all of this decision-making must be patient safety.
Yes, absolutely.
And if we look on to page 68, see that there's a range of options that are set forth, and it's really the fourth option there, beginning rephase. Do you see that?
Yes.
So the email states, rephase the timings of the move into the building to allow a phased occupation over the next few weeks and months. This option was supported as the best option. It would allow the permanent optimum solution for the critical care ventilation issue to be implemented in an empty ward without clinical risk and with limited disruption to the other users of the building. It prevents the need for double moves, including a decant. It would allow DCN services to move in as planned, and it would allow ambulatory paediatric services, including outpatients, therapies, programmed investigations, and day surgery to move in over the summer. Do you see that?
Yes.
So perhaps a disagreement as to how long the pause is going to have to be, but it seems that there's a consensus view emerging over the 3rd of July that the services simply couldn't move on the 9th as planned.
Yes, so there was agreement, I think, yes, there was consensus that the move could not happen on the 9th. And as you say rightly, their supported option was number 4, which was about rephasing the timing. But that was, I assume, predicated on a view that the issue to be resolved was around ventilation and critical care. So, but as I've already explained, I had additional concerns.
Mm-hmm. And at this point in time, did you still have confidence in the leadership team at NHS Lothian?
Yes.
Okay. It's just, if I could ask you to look to your statement, page 100, so it's the main statement, page 177, paragraph 55. And if we pick matters up 3 lines from the end of that paragraph beginning, I could not have, do you see that? Mm-hmm. You say, I could not have confidence in the governance performance of NHSL and consequently that all other required standards in the build had been met. Do you see that? It's obviously a failure on my part. Did you or did you not have confidence in NHS Lothian at this point in time?
So I had confidence in their ability to work with us to resolve this problem. That's not the same as saying I had concerns around the standards of governance and concerns about why was this only being picked up now. I think that's entirely reasonable. But of course, on the 2nd, the 3rd of July, there was a lot that we did not know about how had this problem arisen and why had it gone unnoticed and why were we finding out at the last minute. And then linked to that, my concern to be sure that every other aspect of the build was meeting the required standards.
Okay. But again, just if we think through the meetings that are taking place, the discussions that are taking place, at this point in time, the senior management team at NHS Lothian, they've identified the problem, they've escalated it to Scottish Government, they've highlighted potential resolutions, and they're indicating that they think there should be a pause to make sure there's a resolution. Is that correct?
Yes.
If I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, please, Volume 1 at page 48. So this is an email on the 3rd of July from Alan Morrison of the Scottish Government. And it's perhaps just to pick matters up towards the bottom of the page, if we could zoom in on the section that says there are a lot of unknown factors including. Do you see that?
Yes. So
Mr. Morrison says that there's still a lot of unknown factors, including the safety implications of running the facility with 4 air changes rather than 10. Do you see that?
Yes.
From your perspective, though, that wouldn't really be an unknown, because from your perspective, if there's not 10, it's not going to be safe because it doesn't comply with the guidance. Is that right?
That's right.
And there's a range of other unknown factors, including the risks of modifying the building whilst occupied, which I think we've already covered, the safety of the environment in which the patients are currently occupied, i.e. is the new facility with 4 air changes an hour still safer than the current site, and then the viability of proposed permanent solution has not been sufficiently tested or challenged. We've spoken a little bit about the hospital at Sheen's, the Children's Hospital. The inquiry's heard evidence. It's a Victorian hospital, no mechanical ventilation, issues with the infrastructure, but fundamentally no issues around about provision of safe care to patients. What about the Department for Clinical Neurosciences? What was the position with the DCN at this point in time?
So DCN was arguably the most pressing of the 2 facilities to move to a new build. That was partly around they had an issue in terms of their water in one particular area. The facilities, in common with Sheen's, the building was in some disrepair, but the principal issue that they were addressing and working to mitigate was around water in a particular part of their facility.
Thank you.
And that, from memory, had reduced the capacity that they had, i.e. the number of patients that they could treat.
Okay. So with the hospital at Sheen's, a pause isn't really going to have any particular significant impact, albeit patients are being treated in a substandard physical environment. But with the DCN, there is actually issues because of problems with the water system and a reduction in capacity for the treatment that can be provided to patients. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Thank you. In terms of the chronology, you then make the formal decision on the 4th of July that the hospital is not going to open. Is that correct?
Yes.
And again, I think we've covered the majority of the reasons, but could you just explain in your own words why you make that decision on the 4th of July that the hospital is not going to open?
Because I did not believe that the new hospital, in fact, I knew that in one important area it was not meeting the required standard, and I did not have the assurance I needed to be confident that elsewhere in the building the required standards in terms of, as I've said, water, drainage, other matters, were also being met, and I needed that assurance.
Okay. Thank you. The inquiries heard evidence from Mr Davison, the Chief Executive of NHS Lothian, and his position is that after you made the decision on the 4th that the hospital is not going to open, no one from Scottish Government lifts the phone and lets him know in advance about that decision. Were you aware of that?
I was aware that that is what he said. I think it would be fair to say that colleagues in Scottish Government might query that assertion. And I think Mr Conaghan indicated to the inquiry that there was a conversation that he had the evening before the 4th and the evening of the 3rd, which certainly would give a very clear indication to Mr Davidson that the move was not likely to go ahead on the 9th, and indeed that was one of their own, in fact, their own preferred option.
Mm-hmm. But if Mr Davison's right and he wasn't given the courtesy of a phone call to say the decision has been taken that the hospital is not going to open, why would that be done?
Well, it would not be for me to make that phone call, so I think it's a question best put to other witnesses.
Mm-hmm. As Cabinet Secretary, though, would you not expect your officials, as a common courtesy, to let the Chief Executive of NHS Lothian know that the formal decision had been taken and that the hospital was not going to open?
In this period, to be frank, I had more important things to worry about. I had confidence in my senior officials. I knew that they were in fairly regular contact and discussion with the Chief Executive and other senior members of the NHS Lothian team. And I did not occur to me to question how they were handling those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps just thinking back to when you sat on the board of the National Waiting Time Centre, could you see from the Health Board perspective, if a decision was announced that the hospital wasn't going to open and the Health Board doesn't have advance notice of that could create operational difficulties for them?
No, I think when I was chair of Golden Jubilee Foundation, had we been in this situation and I had the conversations with the DG in Health and with the Chief Operating Officer for NHS Scotland, and indeed had put forward as our preferred option from my hospital and my board that we should pause the move, then it would not be a big surprise to me when that was announced.
One of the points that Mr Davidson made was that he was told explicitly that Scottish Government would require to approve all communications that went out. So at the point in time that the announcement is announced to the public that the hospital is not going to open, he was in a position whereby patients, families, staff members were all asking the managers at NHS Lothian what was happening, and they weren't allowed to communicate directly because any communications had to be approved by the Scottish Government. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was aware of it because it was my decision. And the reason for that decision was because I wanted all communications to be aligned because it was really important that what we said publicly, the support that we put in place, the helpline that was put in place, what the board was doing in terms of rebooking patients for procedures, including outpatient appointments, ensuring that there were staff at the new build to assist anyone who went there instead of where they needed to go now, that all of that was streamlined, smooth, and in place. And the reason for that is because we are telling the public of Lothian, Edinburgh and the Lothians, but wider, that this new hospital is not going to open when they have been led to expect it would open, because at least in one area it is not considered safe. That is at best disconcerting for the wider public, but absolutely upsetting, worrying for patients and staff and their relatives. And they need an assurance that work is underway to get to the bottom of the matter, resolve the issues, and put in place the necessary help and support for them. So that's why I wanted the communications aligned, but also I had made the decision that the new hospital would not open. It felt entirely right to me that I should be accountable to that public for that decision, and therefore I should front those communications. Now, subsequently, there was, of course, absolutely nothing to stop Mr. Davidson communicating with his staff. I communicated directly with his staff, as well as with the unions and others.
But I thought Mr. Davison and NHS Lothian, they weren't allowed to have any communications that weren't pre-approved by the Scottish Government.
That's right.
So how could he have simply had open, frank discussions with his staff if he had to get pre-approval from the Scottish Government?
So there's a presumption in your question that approval from the Scottish Government precludes open, frank communication. And that's a presumption I would dispute.
Okay. So whenever Mr. Davison was told that he couldn't make any communications without Scottish Government approval, he could still simply have had discussions with his staff members, patients, families, without the Scottish Government approval. I'm struggling to follow. It's no doubt.
So communication is written communication. I don't think it's difficult to follow. He would obviously be briefing his senior team on the decision and the work that he was advised. Scottish Government was commissioning, and there was a lot of communication and interchange between the Scottish Government communications team and NHS Lothian's communications team to make sure that everything was aligned and that steps were being put in place. So there's written communication, there's public communication, and then there's internal communication with your staff groups, with your unions, with your senior team, which of course NHS Lothian would have undertaken.
Okay. And were you content with the communication strategy that was put in place?
Yes.
Thank you. Lord Brew, I'm conscious that's just after 11:30. Now might be an appropriate time to take a break.
Ms. Freeman, as I indicated, we usually take a coffee break about now. Could I ask you to be back by 10 to 12?
Thank you.
Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Lord. Mr. Freeman, just before the break, we were discussing the communication strategy, and you'd explained why Scottish Government and yourself as Cabinet Secretary had taken control of communications. I won't go through your statement, but for the benefit of the Chair's notes, in your first statement, you cover that at page 182 at paragraph 75. And then in your second statement, you cover that on page 17 at paragraph 18. But essentially, you wanted to ensure that all communications were what you describe as consistent, transparent, open and straightforward. Is that correct?
That's correct. And in addition, that I led them as the person who'd made a decision and as the elected person accountable to Parliament and people of Scotland.
And you were content, you said before the break, with the communication strategy.
Yes.
I'd just like to draw to your attention some observations that have been made by patients and family groups in relation to their view of the communication strategy, which is rather different. So Leslie King, who was the mother of a child being treated at the hospital in Sheens, she provided a witness statement to the inquiry. This is her observation at paragraph 79 of her statement on the communications. She says, as parents, we did not have any formal communication from the hospital or the health board about why the move to the new hospital had been delayed in July 2019. I only heard about the reasons for the delay from what I read in the press. The staff in the hospital were very open and frank with us and told us what they knew, which was not a lot. Then she goes on at paragraph 80 to say, there was never any communications from the chief executive of the hospital or anyone in management to us acknowledging the delay or the effects it had on the patients and families. Yes, the chief executive had been on the ward at the time of the delay, but we were focused on treatment and too upset to speak with the chief exec at that point. It was a similar situation when the health secretary visited the ward. Viewed in that context as that the experiences of patients and families, do you still think that the communications with patients and families were adequate and appropriate?
Well, just on the point about staff, I personally wrote to staff on at least 2 occasions, and one of those would have been around the 4th of July, explaining why I'd taken the decision. And then later in 18th or 19th of July, updating them on where we were at that point, particularly for those staff that I wasn't able to meet when I visited both DCN and Sheens. In terms of parents, I completely appreciate what your witness has said, and I'm sorry that they feel that they were ignored by the board, but also I would take it as ignored also by me, and that is remiss because I think it is really important that patients and families know what is happening and why it's happening, including what we don't know at any particular time, but what we're doing about it.
So if we just think perhaps the recommendations the Chair may want to make, you've explained the difficulties. It's clearly a busy period, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, when the decision's being made. Given the experiences of patients and families, their perspective of the communication strategy, how do you think that could be improved if a situation like this ever arose again?
I think very straightforwardly, I think that it would be entirely possible, given that it was possible and the Health Board did an exceptional job in contacting patients to rebook them, either for procedures or for outpatient appointments over a very short period of time. Therefore, that information is available. It would be straightforward to send a letter, more than once actually. You could send an initial letter that says, we're really sorry, but for safety reasons, we can't open the hospital when we planned, and work is underway, what we know and what we don't know. And then you could send a further letter at a later stage, keeping people up to date. So I think that would be an important thing to do should we ever be in that situation again.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look to a briefing note, please. Bundle 13, Volume 4 at page 469. So bundle 13, volume 4, page 469. So as a briefing note, just confirming some communications that took place. So the first bullet point says you wrote to staff on 18 July and visited the existing sick kids and DCN sites the same day to provide an update and to answer questions that staff may have in response to the decision to delay moving the hospital to the new site. I'll come on to ask you about that site visit in a moment. It's the next bullet point. Alex Joyce Unison, Employee Director and Joint Staff Side Chair of NHS Lothian, wrote to you on 23 July 2019 requesting a meeting to discuss concerns that staff side had been excluded from any communications regarding the decision not to open the sick kids hospital. These concerns were also raised with the press, including in the Scotsman. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recollect what were Alex Joyce's concerns that were raised with you?
So from memory, the concerns were that the staff side unions in NHS Lothian had not been advised during the period where discussions were underway and at the time or immediately thereafter about the decision not to go ahead with the opening of the hospital on the 9th of July. That's my memory of that. But there may have been other concerns that they had that I'm not recalling.
Do you think the unions should have been more involved in the decision-making process than they were?
Not necessarily. The unions certainly were involved subsequently because a number of the matters that we asked NSS to look at came directly from the staff side in NHS Lothian and specifically from Unison. But in the decision-making itself, I don't believe so. But I do take the point, if my recollection is correct, that Mr. Joyce is making about informing them sooner than they were informed. And of course, as the note then goes on to explain, I met the unions, I met staff side on the 13th of August. And we continued that dialogue.
So again, in fairness, the minute does continue to say that you met on the 13th, then you confirmed your position in writing to Alex Joyce on the 19th of August. And then the next bullet point says, upon publication of the reports, you wrote again to Alex Joyce and to all affected staff in NHS Lothian on the 11th of September. So from the point Mr. Joyce, or the point Alex Joyce raises matters with you, there does seem to be engagement, but again, if we're just thinking about how these things could perhaps be better done in the future, do you think that there could be closer and better communication with unions and staff than took place in the early period in July?
So I think there was direct communication from me to staff in July, in the early period and then mid-July. But that should not be at the expense of no direct communication with staff side representatives, which of course encompasses all the unions involved in healthcare.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look to bundle 7, please, volume 1, page 86, which is a record of an interview that you did on the BBC Radio Scotland on the 5th of July 2019. If we could perhaps pick matters up around a third of the way down, there's an entry in the left, JF, and it's attributed to say, I did, and I did that entirely for patient safety. Do you see that?
Yes.
So you say, I did, and I did that entirely for patient safety because there's two reasons. One, of course, it's critical care needs to be safe. It needs to meet national standards. You can't have an emergency department if you don't have critical care. But also because this was picked up so late, I want to be assured that all other safety checks in the rest of the hospital are also conducted against independently and that they meet national standards too. Do you see that?
Yes.
So that was the messaging that you were providing on the 5th of July, explaining to the public why you had taken the decision that you had.
Yes.
And if we look down approximately 2/3 of the way down the page, you see there's an entry, JF, that says, yes, and so one of the things that I need to find out is why NHS Lothian is so confident. Do you see that? It says, yes, and so one of the things that I need to find out is why NHS Lothian is so confident that the hospital was meeting all those standards when self-evidently in critical care it certainly wasn't. Do you see that?
Yes.
So did you get to the bottom of that issue about NHS Lothian had been very confident but the standards weren't being met? Did you get to the bottom of how that had taken place?
Well, yes, because it partly relates to what we were discussing earlier and a matter we've not yet come to. And that's twofold. First of all, NHS Lothian were receiving assurances from their advisors in terms of how the project was proceeding, and that they had given the assurance in response to Paul Gray's letter in January, which I think came from the Strategic Facilities Group's concerns arising primarily about water in Queen Elizabeth, but touching on other areas. So they had given those assurances in response to Paul Gray's letter, and they were, I presume, relying on receiving those assurances from their advisors in terms of standards. But what wasn't happening, as we've touched on earlier, is scrutiny within governance structures. And I think the second difficulty, which I became aware of, is that when assurance is given that a particular aspect of the built environment is meeting standards, it is primarily a paper-based exercise. And so nobody is literally going and switching on the lights to make sure the lights work. They have all the paperwork to say the lights work, and they tick and say the lights work. And so that was standard practice. That wasn't something where NHS Lothian had got it wrong or specific to them. It was standard practice. And that, it occurred to me, was not in the final result the kind of assurance that we needed in critical areas of a built environment.
And we'll perhaps come on to discuss this slightly more with NHS Scotland Assure, but you're very clear in your statement in terms of saying, in your view, what the Centre of Excellence needs to be is effectively a clerk of work, someone walking around with a clipboard. You describe it as pushing buttons, being the type of person that someone wouldn't want being on site, asking all the difficult questions. That's your vision of what the Centre of Excellence should be. Is that right?
That's part of what I wanted it to be. Where you actually, when you say you've tested ventilation, water, drainage, fire dampeners, you actually have gone and tested them. Now, when you do that, at what point in a build you do that, of course, is for those with the relevant expertise to decide. But again, if you think about a more personal situation with your own home, if you buy a new home, or if you have work done in your home, you actually do go and press those buttons and turn on those switches to check that the work that's said to have been done and you're paying to have been done has actually been done. You don't simply take a bunch of paperwork from the builder and it's all ticked and you're happy. So it seemed to me that we needed to find a way to reinsert that actual physical testing of critical aspects. And as you say, I characterise that as a clerk of works.
The inquiries obtain statements from individuals that work at NHS Scotland Assure, and their position is whatever the new body is not fulfilling that clerk of works role. It's not doing any inspecting. It's not doing any testing. If that's right, if the clerk of works model that you had envisaged hasn't taken place, is that a missed opportunity in your view?
It's only a missed opportunity if nobody is doing it. So it may be the case because, of course, what has happened with NHS Assure, I have not been part of and ought not to comment because I've not been there to understand how it has developed and been established. But what I would say is, if that is not what they're doing, I would think it is their job to make sure that somebody is doing that.
So regardless of who physically does it, if you're having a centre of excellence, there should be someone that has done those physical checks, in your view.
Yes.
Thank you. Just perhaps to finish matters off on the radio interview, if I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 87. So there's a comment made during the course of the interview that it's the same contractors that have worked on the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People. And you'll see that the question posed at the top, it says, well, was the mistake to have the same firm build both hospitals, the QEU and the sick kids in Edinburgh? And your response is, well, there is no indication at this point that any fault lies with the contractors themselves. Do you see that?
Yes.
So did you subsequently consider that there was any fault that lay at the door of the contractors themselves?
I don't think I formed a view on that. Primarily because I had no engagement with the contractors. I did not put questions to them, and consequently they did not have the opportunity of answering those questions to me. So we certainly had no indication at that point, and I was not prepared to say anything other. But subsequently, there would be no basis for me saying that there was or was not any fault on their part. What I was focused on was NHS Lothian's responsibility as a statutory body, and arising from that, as we've touched on, whether or not the role of Scottish Government in these major builds is as fulsome as it might need to be.
Thank you. The reason I raise it is the inquiry's heard evidence that with the NPD model, it was meant to be a move towards more of a partnership approach in terms of these new build hospitals. So you had a project company that was set up, but it had a public interest director that sat on the board. It was to try to foster this idea that the parties were working in partnership. Do you find it surprising against that backdrop that the contractors built a hospital where the air changes were less than 50% of what is set out in the published guidance without raising that issue specifically with NHS Lothian?
I genuinely don't think I'm qualified to comment on that, because I'm, as I've said, I've not had conversations with the contractors, so I've not had the benefit of their explanation about the approach that they took and why they took it, nor have they had the benefit of putting that to me. So I don't believe I'm qualified or that it would be fair for me to comment in response to that.
Thank you. If we put the radio interview to one side, we've heard already that you attended a site visit at the Children's Hospital on the 18th of July. The inquiry's heard evidence of the experiences of patients and families when they found out the new hospital wasn't opening. The evidence indicates that patients and families were flattened. They were very, very scared about what was going to happen to their children, and they were very, very upset. What was your experience of visiting the hospital on the 18th of July and meeting patients, families and staff members?
It was that. I also visited DCN on the same day, and I had with me Malcolm Wright as the Director General for Health and Dr. Catherine Calderwood as the CMO. And I very deliberately had it as a small visit, as opposed to sometimes what you get is the whole ministerial entourage, because I wanted as much of the time that we were there as possible to be spent listening to what staff primarily, because it was primarily staff I met, were saying to me. So I wanted to be able to explain directly to them why I'd taken the decision I'd taken, what we had put in train to try to get to the bottom of this, what we had put in train to see what else might need to be done in the hospital. The fact that I did not know at that point how long any of this might take, all the things that I didn't know, and the commitment to keep them up to date and informed. And of course, as I've said, parallel to that, I wrote to all staff. What I heard from them was very similar. People were upset. They were shocked. They were frustrated because they'd waited a long time. They were surrounded by packing cases. They had made personal arrangements in terms of how they would get to the new hospital compared to where they were currently based. Some had taken on roles specifically because it was going to be in the new facility. But at the same time, I had no one say to me they thought it was the wrong decision. They all went very quickly to the point of if it's not safe, we shouldn't go. But I also wanted to follow on from that in the discussion with them and be there for as long as we needed to be there. So if you have to stay here and we don't know how long that might be, what does this hospital need then? What do you need? And there were a number of suggestions about basic maintenance, the kind of things that had been allowed reasonably to run down because there was an expectation of a move. But some major points, A&E, Jeane's being the main example, where the clinicians very clearly pointed out the removal of a pillar would, and the reallocation of space would allow better patient observation and better patient flow, and therefore make their jobs significantly easier. Similarly, there was issues raised about support and accommodation for families, a situation I knew of personally from my own family about what was available there. Not every patient, a young person or child requiring critical care attention is from the Edinburgh area. Often they have come from quite far afield. So there's a need for improved accommodation and support for families. And then when we went to DCN, again, a similar exercise and a similar response from staff there.
Thank you. And if I can ask you to look to Bundle 7, please, Volume 2, page 113. We see a briefing that was provided to the First Minister. Bundle 7, Volume 2, page 113. If I could ask you to look to paragraph 7, please. The briefing notes NHS Lothian have also been asked to monitor any complaints received about the situation, but no complaints have been reported. Do you see that?
Yes.
So anger, frustration, disappointment on the part of patients, families and staff members, but fundamentally people aren't actually making formal complaints about what has happened. Is that correct?
Yes, there were no formal complaints, as I understand it, to Scottish Government, and NHS Lothian advised us that they had at that point not received any either. Of course, the unions were raising issues, and as I said, I can't recall exactly. It may have been on fire, the fire question, but the unions were asking for NSS to look at other areas inside the new build. It was on drainage, in fact.
Thank you. And you've outlined the difficulties associated with the hospital's suboptimal environment at Jeane's, the issues arising from the water quality in particular at the DCN. But in your position as Cabinet Secretary, were you aware of any information suggesting that there were any adverse clinical outcomes for any patient associated with the hospital not opening?
No, I was not aware of that. And I know that the CMO was in conversation with the clinical teams in both sites, both before and after that visit, and had she been aware of any, she would have raised those with me.
Thank you. And just on the briefing to the First Minister, if we look to paragraph 8, the site visit, the briefing states, on Thursday I visited both the existing Children's Hospital and the DCN at the Western General Hospital. Both visits were extremely helpful as they allowed me to see firsthand the level of disappointment and inconvenience for staff that the delay has caused, and also the impact and disruption on patients. Do you see that?
Yes.
So escalation so that the First Minister is aware of these very significant difficulties that are occurring as a result of the problems with the project.
Yes.
Just to look to the scale of the issues that we're facing, patients and families, if I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, please, Volume 1, at page 303. So Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 303. We just look to paragraph 2 under the bold heading, NHS Lothian Patient Contact. It says, as you're aware, NHS Lothian have been contacting patients by telephone for those who have appointments in July and issuing letters to patients who have scheduled appointments from August. We met NHS Lothian today and requested regular information on the patient contact position, and these reports will now be provided from Thursday, the 11th July. The total number of outpatient appointments for the month of July across the affected areas are paediatrics is 1,586 and the DCN is 669. Do you see that?
Yes.
A total of 2,255. And then it continues at paragraph 3. NHS Lothian have made contact with over 800 paediatric patients and 101 of the DCN patients. Do you see that?
Yes.
So for this 1 month, presumably there's impacts for further months, but you're talking about just under 1,000 patients that are going to be impacted by this issue.
Yes.
At this point in time, had you reached any preliminary views as to where the fault lay in terms of the problems with the hospital and the hospital not opening?
So this is round about the
time of the site visit, 18th of July.
No definitive view. No.
Okay. If I could ask you to have before you, please, Mr. Davison's statement. So that's in bundle 2 of the witness statements. And if we could look to page 227 and paragraph 128. If I could ask you to look at approximately 4 lines down, you'll see there's a sentence beginning, so the meeting didn't really go well. Do you see that?
Yes.
So Mr. Davison says, so the meeting didn't really go well, and then she, that's referring to you, Ms. Freeman, expressed her view that it was the board's failure, and in particular a failure of governance. Do you recall any such discussion taking place?
So could you remind me what meeting we're talking about?
So I think at this point in time, it's approximately around about this time. So it's around about the time where the decision's been taken that the hostel's not going to open, and then there's a series of meetings. It's not clear if this is happening at the site visit on the 18th or a subsequent site visit, but it's a meeting that you had whereby there were certain individuals present, including Mr. Davison.
Yes, it may be the meeting I had immediately before I met the staff and others at Sheen's and then DCN. And it was with Mr. Davidson and the chair of the board, Brian Houston. So it may have well been that meeting.
And does that accurately reflect your views in relation to where the fault lay?
Not really. I don't believe I was dismissive either. I simply wasn't interested in long explanations about funding mechanisms and complications and complexities around who is responsible for what. What I was interested in was whether or not the chief executive and chair of the board understood that given their statutory responsibility, they were, notwithstanding who else may have an involvement here, they were responsible for the situation we were now in, and that had to be in some part a failure of governance. I don't believe I said it was the board's failure, but I would have made a point about failure in governance.
Okay, thank you. Because at this stage, I'd like to just move on and deal with the third issue, really some of the problems with the project. And you outlined at the start that really you thought that the germ of the problem was human error right back at the start before you were Cabinet Secretary in relation to issues arising from the environmental matrix. And the fact that's not picked up at subsequent stages, is that correct?
Yes.
You'll be aware...
I actually think the germ of the problem is the fact that it's not picked up at various stages, because everyone can make a mistake. So the mistake being made potentially triggers where we end up, but only because at no point is it picked up.
Because Grant Thornton, in their report commissioned by NHS Lothian, they refer to the matter as collective failure. Have you seen that report, and
yes,
are you familiar with that term? Was that your view, that this is just a collective failure over the whole project?
So, in part, I think would be my view. I don't think it is fair to pinpoint the blame, if you like, on any one individual. I think it is a failure of governance. And that means that either the right people weren't in the room when these matters when governance was being practiced, or the right questions were not being asked or pursued. Because I know from my experience as chair of a board as well as member of the board, that you can ask the right question, but if you just then sit back and accept whatever answer you're given, that's not really governance either. So in that sense, I think there are a series of failures, but they are for me primarily around governance.
Okay. And if we're talking about a failure in governance, a collective failure, does that include the Scottish Government as well?
No, I don't believe it does, because the Scottish Government delivered the role that it had always delivered in these matters. And of course, we have other instances of major builds around the same time, which are delivered by and large on time and on budget, and without these issues arising, with Scottish Government playing exactly the same role in regard to them as they did here. That, of course, is notwithstanding my earlier comment that I do think the role of Scottish Government in relation to major healthcare builds going forward is worthy of examination.
And should I take from that you think the whole model at the minute may actually be wrong, and that's part of the problem?
I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that it is worthy of examination. And part of the reason why I say that is from the point of view of the public of Scotland, they really don't care who's got what statutory responsibility for what. What they care about is that public projects are well designed, well managed, well delivered, and appear preferably on time and as close to budget as possible. And the only place they can look to for accountability for that is Scottish Government and Scottish ministers, regardless of who that is. So given that is rightly where the public looks, and rightly then the responsibility of Scottish Government and Scottish ministers, it is self-evident to me that therefore, if you're going to be accountable for something, you need to have a greater role in it. But the reason I say worthy of consideration is because there is a legal framework in place that gives boards a legally defined statutory responsibility. And so you can't sweep that aside. You need to think through carefully, how do you get a better balance between Scottish Government, central government and health boards?
Thank you. In addition to the Grant Thornton report, you'll be aware that KPMG were commissioned by the Scottish Government to also produce a report. And they describe matters as being a human error. They list a range of potential missed opportunities. Is that correct?
Yes.
If I could ask you to look to a briefing that was prepared on the KPMG report, if we could look to Bundle 8, page 91, please. This is a briefing prepared on the KPMG draft report. You see that there's a summary of the findings, paragraph 6, 3 lines up from the bottom. It says, this appears to have stemmed from a document produced by NHS Lothian at the tender stage in 2012, which was inconsistent with SHTM 0301 and which was referred to throughout the project. And if we could look on, please, to page 93, you see at the top it records that the cost of the KPMG report was £300,000. And then in the summary section at paragraph 22, it says the main issue contained in the report is that a mistake included in the tender documentation was not picked up at any stage over the next 7 years, despite the fact that there was appropriate professional and technical involvement in the project and that the governance arrangements operated as planned. The other issue of focus is that because the report provides a comprehensive summary of each issue that this project has had to deal with, it brings attention to the unusually high number of problems with this project has experienced, and we may be asked why we did not intervene earlier. Do you see that? So yes. Why didn't the Scottish Government intervene earlier?
Well, it's not clear to me from that report that the unusually high number of problems were all brought to the attention of Scottish Government, so I can't comment on why Government did not intervene earlier, or if Government should have intervened earlier.
And then if we look on to paragraph 23, it says, in addition to the obvious question as to why the ventilation problem was not identified by the board or any of its technical advisors, criticism of the project are likely to include questions about, and then there's a series of questions. It says, why the contract was signed in February 2015 before the design was complete. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did you ever investigate or get to the bottom of why is this contract signed in February 2015 before the design is complete?
No, I didn't.
Okay. The next question is, why was the practical completion certificate signed in February 2019 while there remained a large number of issues that needed to be resolved? Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you know why did that take place?
I don't know. I can't comment on that. I did not know that there remained a large number of issues that needed to be resolved.
It then continues, why are we paying a monthly charge for a hospital we can't use? Do you see that? Like, that's an issue I think that the public would want to know. £1.4 million every month is being paid for a hospital that can't be occupied. Why was that the case?
It was the case because NHS Lothian accepted the handover. And as soon as they did, they were liable to pay that monthly charge. So they accepted the building, in effect, and were then liable by contract to pay that monthly charge. I found it galling too, but it was NHS Lothian's decision and it was part of the contract.
But it's the Scottish Government that provides the money. So is the key failing here not the fact that there's just assumptions made that everything's okay on the part of the Scottish Government at the point of settlement agreement 1?
No, I don't accept that. The key failing is that where everything is not okay, NHS Lothian are either not aware or not raising it with Scottish Government.
And then the final issue says, how can we have technical guidance on ventilation systems which lacks clarity and is open to interpretation? Do you see that?
Yes.
Was that an issue of concern to you?
No, it was never raised with me that our technical guidance on ventilation systems lacked clarity. I don't know if that refers to a debate that I do know happens and I think has been rehearsed with this inquiry about whether it should be 10 or whether it should be another number, whether it is guidance or mandatory and etc. But my position, as I've said, was clear. We have guidance drawn by experts to represent best practice, and it says 10.
One of the issues that the inquiries heard evidence about is the fact that there did seem to be different interpretations of what the guidance required. Certainly in 2014, there's new guidance in 2022. But you effectively had two schools of thought. You had IOM Limited, who do the testing on the one hand. They say all critical care rooms need positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour. You then had the design team, TUV Sud, who even whenever this issue was raised, and even in their evidence to this inquiry, still say the 2014 guidance, properly understood, didn't need 10 air changes per hour and positive pressure in all rooms in critical care. It simply had to be in isolation rooms. At the relevant time, when you were making these decisions on the project, were you aware that the guidance was being interpreted in different ways by different engineers?
Not in those early days in July. Subsequently, I was aware that there was a difference of interpretation, but my clinical advisors were very clear to me that it required 10 changes per hour in critical care.
Okay, so the advice that you received later on in the project, was that effectively that properly understood there's only one way of reading the guidance and the views of TUV Sud were an outlier? Or were they saying, this is my interpretation, but I can see that there is an alternative interpretation of the guidance?
Well, I think I'm not aware, I'm not recalling that it was ever put to me like that, but I think I imagine that part of the reason why the guidance has been updated is an attempt to address concerns that may exist around clarity or it being open to different interpretations.
But is this back to what you tell us at paragraph 195, at page 195, paragraph 116 of your statement, that the standards were there for a reason? So from your point of view, if you have the standards, you should be complying fully with those standards?
Absolutely.
Do you think any of the difficulties associated with the project were related to it being revenue funded through an NPD model as opposed to being a capital and build project?
I don't believe I'm particularly qualified to comment on that. If I go back to my point about governance and the practice of governance, that applies regardless of what funding mechanism you're using.
Thank you. The next issue I'd wish to go into, and this is really the fourth issue that I raised at the start, and that's the remedial works carried out and the decision to open the hospital. The inquiry's heard evidence that there's an escalation of NHS Lothian to level 3 and then to level 4. If I could ask you to look, please, to Bundle 7, Volume 1. And if we could look to page 293, please. So Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 293. So there's a framework set out here from stage 1 to stage 5. We see stage 3 says significant variation from plan, risks materialising, tailored support required. And then stage 4 would be significant risks to delivery, quality, financial performance or safety, senior level external support required. Do you see that? For those of us not familiar with this escalation framework, could you perhaps just talk us through your understanding of what it is and what would have to happen for a board to be escalated to stage 3, stage 4, and then ultimately to stage 5?
So the escalation framework is essentially about the levels of direct support that Scottish Government or the Health Director believe a board needs from them in order to meet its targets and its obligations. And so it sets itself out. It is self-explanatory. It is primarily, in fact, it is not a decision of a cabinet secretary which level a board is at, with the exception of stage 5, where there are, as it says, ministerial powers of intervention, very rarely used, in fact. But prior to that, it is a collective decision either by the senior management team in the Health Directorate or by the DG, him or herself. In terms of stage 3, and it more or less tells you what is required, stage 3 is significant variation from plan could be significant variation in terms of performance, on waiting times, on other areas of performance, including financial performance. It could be where a board, in terms of mortality and morbidity stats, is an outlier compared to the rest of the country. And then that triggers the kind of support that it says. Stage 4 is where there are risks to delivery, and the senior level support is required.
So escalation to level 3, that's not a decision directly taken by you as Cabinet Secretary, but presumably something that you're aware of.
Yes.
And is it at that stage that the Oversight Board is created?
It can be. It's not all. I don't believe it is always the case that an Oversight Board is created, but it can be. And I think in NHS Lothian's situation, it was escalated to stage 3, in part, because, at least in part, if not totally, from memory, because of performance on delivery targets, not specifically this project.
Okay, so the escalation to level 3 is not specifically or only limited to the problems associated with the project?
No, it's not.
If I could ask you to look to the terms of reference for the Oversight Board, so that's Bundle 7, Volume 2, at page 352. So Bundle 7, Volume 2 at page 352, which is the terms of reference. And then if we could look on to page 354, please. See the background, section 2, following the decision to halt the planned move to the new hospital facilities on 9 July, an Oversight Board is being established to provide advice to ministers on readiness of the facility to open and on migration of services to the new facility. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then towards the bottom of the page, we see that the scope of work that's to be undertaken by the Oversight Board, which includes advice on phased occupation. The final bullet point there says identification of areas that could be done differently in the future. Do you see that?
Yes.
The inquiry hasn't seen any documentation suggesting that the Oversight reported on the identification of areas that could be done differently. Are you aware of why the Oversight Board didn't report on those issues?
Well, if I'm correct, NHS Lothian was escalated to level 3 on the 10th of July or thereabouts, but raised to level 4 on the 13th of September. So it is entirely possible that between the 10th of July and the 13th of September, the board in that sense had not got to that point. The further escalation arose, as I understand it, because by September, we understood that there was more than ventilation in critical care to be addressed. There was also issues in theatre and in other areas. And that was from the NSS report.
And again, the escalation to level 4, a decision you're aware of, but not a decision directly being taken by you as Cabinet Secretary.
No, it's not.
If I could just ask you to look to Bundle 7, please, Volume 3, page 564, which is the letter of 13th September 2019. So Bundle 7, Volume 3, page 564, which is the letter of the 13th of September recording the escalation. If we look to the second full paragraph, it says, having reviewed the contents of both reports that were published on Wednesday, 11th September, I have concluded on the basis of scale of the challenge in delivering the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People that NHS Lothian is escalated to level 4 of our performance framework for this specific project. This level is defined as significant risk to delivery, quality, financial performance or safety, senior level external transformational support required. Do you see that?
Yes.
So the specific escalation to level 4 is related to the project, is
Yes,
that right?
it is.
And it records that a senior programme director, Mary Morgan, is going to be appointed to assist with the project. So in terms of the next stages in the project, is that really high value change notice 107 and settlement agreement 2, which effectively are contracts to make sure that the ventilation system in critical care fully complies with IOM's interpretation of SHTM 0301, is that right?
It is, as well as addressing the other matters that the NSS report raises.
Okay, and I won't take you through all of the board minutes for the Oversight Board, but the Oversight Board meets on a regular basis. Can you just try to explain, in this period of time, the Oversight Board is in place, you still have NHS Lothian, you've got the Oversight Board, the Senior Programme Director. What is now being fed back to you? What's the role of Scottish Government in this phase on the project?
So what's been fed back to me is a report after every Oversight Board. And if there are any other issues between board meetings, then that will be raised by me at that point. I believe Professor McQueen is chairing the Oversight Board. So she would update me either verbally, but certainly there would always be a written report after each Oversight Board meeting.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look to bundle 3, please, page 531, which is a minute of the Oversight Board dated the 5th of December 2019.
Thank you.
Do you see that? And
Yes.
then if we could look over the page onto page 532 and to the first bullet point beginning the NHSL Board. So the minute states the NHSL Board had taken their governance responsibility seriously and whilst not happy about the current situation, realised that this was the only option available to progress the opening of the hospital. The Board reluctantly agreed the proposal. The NHSL Board had requested Oversight Board approval of the decision which they were agreeing to, as it was appreciated that the NHSL Board would be signing the public sector up to unknown financial risks and currently no programme certainty associated with progressing with the proposal. They wished this concern to be made clear to the Scottish Government and Cabinet Secretary, given how the actions of the NHSL Board may be viewed in the future. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember this issue being escalated to you as Cabinet Secretary?
Yes.
And can you just explain what discussion is taking place here in this minute that's subsequently being escalated to you?
So what is being discussed there, and I would be aware of it before the Oversight Board, quite rightly, was what was necessary in order to pursue a programme of work with the relevant contractors and others to address the deficiencies in the build.
And that could involve signing the public purse up to what's described there as unknown financial risks.
Yes.
I appreciate that from the answers you've given earlier, you might not be able to comment on this in terms of the contractual structure, but the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence about one of the benefits of the revenue funded model, the NPD model, is meant to be that it places all of the design risk onto the private sector, so that's not borne by the public sector. The inquiry's heard evidence that what really happens in terms of high value change notice 107 and settlement agreement 2 is that the original design team and contractor, they fall away, they're not going to do those works. So effectively a lot of the risk that should in an ideal world sit with the private sector, that doesn't happen. Is that something that was being explained to you at this point in time, that the standard risk profile was going to change for the project?
Yes.
And again, do you have any views in terms of whether that perhaps highlights problems with this type of structure that theoretically puts the risk onto the private sector, but in reality achieving that can be very difficult?
Well, I can't comment as to whether it highlights problems with that overall approach. It certainly highlighted a problem here. But again, in this situation, you're not looking between a good option and a bad option. You're looking at what needs to be done in order to realise this building as a safe environment for patients and staff, given the level of investment that has already been made in it, versus not doing it. And I was, of course, acutely conscious that the additional cost of undertaking the work, I'm not sure that was the view of unknown financial risk was the board's view. I'm not sure that Scottish Government officials would have characterised it in that way. But there was a cost to fixing these problems. It was no longer one problem. There were a number of problems. There was a cost to that. There was also an associated cost of maintaining the Jeane site and DCN and undertaking the additional works there that were required. And that had to come from the health budget. And I think in one of the statements I made to Parliament, I was clear that we would not be looking to NHS Lothian for that additional money from their budget, but the overall health budget would have to pay. And that meant that the consequence of that was that other areas where we might wish to spend money, we would not be spending money. So the overall health portfolio, if you like, was the loser here.
Thank you. The inquiry's heard a lot of evidence about the works that are done, testing that's carried out in the period up to the hospital ultimately opening. Can you just perhaps explain to us what updates are you provided with in terms of key stages to ensure that the hospital is safe? In your analysis, it complies with published guidance. What were you being told?
So I'm receiving, as I said, reports from every oversight board meeting. And when any of those reports or any of the information coming from Mary Morgan through Fiona McQueen to me is concerned with the validation and assurance of any of the works that's being done, then I am asking the question about who has validated that and assured us. And I'm also wanting to be sure, for example, with DCN. So in terms of once we were clearer about all the work that needed to be done and how long that might take, of course, COVID interrupted that, but how long that might take, we were looking to see whether it was possible to phase entry to allow DCN to move sooner than anywhere else. And what would that mean for the programme of remedial and improvement works that were needed? And I was keen that any move was one that the clinical teams were comfortable with. Not only that they were comfortable that where they were going was fit for purpose and safe, but also the manner in which the phasing was undertaken was one that they were agreeable to in terms of the patients that they were caring for.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look within the Oversight Board minutes, please, to Bundle 3, page 1095, which is a minute of the Oversight Board from the 25th of February 2021. So a minute of the Oversight Board on the 25th of February 2021. And then if we could look on to page 1097, please.
Thank you.
1097, please. And it's the second last bullet point beginning, Miss Morgan outlined. Do you see that?
Yes.
Miss Morgan outlined that the last year had been spent correcting the pressure cascade in the new hospital. In that period, the critical care and Lochranza ward ventilation systems had been rebuilt, CAMs had been stripped out and reopened, and all other items in the HFS report had been addressed. The new hospital was now one of the safest and best buildings in the whole of Scotland. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recall that type of dialogue being fed back to you as Cabinet Secretary?
Yes.
So effectively here, there's the works that have been carried out, HFS are involved in that and reporting on it, and Mary Morgan, the Senior Programme Director, in her personal opinion, the hospital is now one of the safest and best buildings in the whole of Scotland.
Yes.
You addressed within your statement the fact that there is a phased opening of the hospitals. And can you just explain in your own words, why did you decide that these hospitals were now safe enough to open? What had changed from the point on the 4th of July?
So the issues that had been identified prior to the 4th of July on the 2nd, and the subsequent issues that had been identified, the critical issues that had been identified in the NSS report, had all been addressed. And assurances had been received that they had been tested and validated and they met the required standards.
Thank you. And you mentioned obviously the particular difficulties associated with the DCN and the fact that there might need to be more of a move. And you mentioned the impact of COVID on potentially transferring. But for COVID, could the DCN potentially have opened at an earlier stage than it did?
That's possible. COVID, although there was an exemption given to healthcare facilities in terms of the prohibition on construction, nonetheless, there were issues with supply chain during COVID in terms of some companies in the supply chain made the decision to furlough their staff, so they were no longer available. There were issues around social distancing during the COVID period, so you didn't have as many staff in a particular physical area as you might otherwise have. So that slows everything down. So COVID did have an impact in slowing down the work that was needed to be done to get the hospital to the standards that we required it.
Thank you. And you addressed the phased moves within your statement, but just to be clear, by the time you made the decision to open the hospital, did you have any concerns as to whether it failed to provide a suitable environment for safe, effective, patient-centred care?
In terms of the built environment, no, I did not.
And is that as a result of all of the testing and assurances that you've outlined,
Yes,
both in your evidence today and within your statements?
Yes.
Thank you. I now want to move on and just ask you a few questions about NHS Scotland Assure. You've outlined both in your statements and in your evidence why you thought there was a need for a new centre of excellence. But before we come to that, if I could perhaps just ask you a few questions about Health Facilities Scotland. The inquiries heard evidence that Health Facilities Scotland, at the point in time that both the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences and the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital were being built, there was only one engineer that was actually within Health Facilities Scotland. Do you think that was problematic?
Yes, I would think it would be, yes.
And what do you think were some of the challenges that faced HFS because it only had one engineer working in it at that time?
Well, during that period, we were asking them to focus and do a fair amount of work on the issues around Queen Elizabeth. So they were focused in that direction, and then there was also the situation here with this hospital. So they were stretched, I would have said.
So in terms of the new Centre for Excellence, was one issue that was going to have to be addressed resourcing?
Yes, I believe so. But the point, from my mind, the point of what was initially described as a new Centre of Excellence, now NHS Scotland Assure, was, as I've said in my statement, so it is unlikely that during the tenure of a chief executive of a health board, that they will have more than one major project like this one to oversee and take final responsibility for. And that applies to their teams as well. And some of them will go through their entire tenure with no such responsibility. they're not appointed for their skill set that is about leading a major build of a healthcare facility. And so it seemed to me a degree unfair to expect a great deal from them in terms of construction, technical expertise, and so on, without providing them with a central resource that they could draw on that had that expertise, but also by being a central resource could look to continuous improvement, could look elsewhere beyond Scotland, to the rest of the UK, to Europe and elsewhere, to comparable systems and learn lessons and implement improvements and perhaps contribute to good practice elsewhere as well. So that was my thinking behind, in a country of 5 million, just over 5 million, we don't need to keep replicating this exercise over and over again every time we have a major build. Why don't we centralise the expertise that is then there for any health board to draw on when it is their time to undertake a major healthcare development like this one?
So is one of your reflections that there really needs to be greater standardisation in terms of healthcare buildings?
I think one of my reflections is that we need to be absolutely certain that from design all the way through every stage to delivery, best practice on infection prevention and control is in the built environment. That it is, of course, around the expertise and experience of staff at every level in healthcare to practice and deliver effective infection prevention and control, bearing in mind that you cannot guarantee no infection, but the built environment is critical to that.
And in terms of just thinking about that issue, if you are in a health board, a new build hospital might be either a once or a never in a career event. Do you think it's realistic to ask those individuals to take forward these types of projects, or should there really be a central building division within the NHS?
So there you are touching upon what I described earlier as the balance that needs to be struck between the statutory responsibility of individual territorial health boards and any central facility. And that I think is an area that has not had sufficient attention and discussion. I'm not proposing a solution to that at all. Don't believe I am qualified to do so without that consideration and discussion. But I don't think we can continue to pretend that that tension isn't there. I think part of my reasoning for what is now NHS Scotland Assure was to try and find one way to provide health boards with expertise and skill that they could use. I don't mean any disrespect to independent technical advisors, independent design teams, construction. But if you are in a health board because you are the medical director or the chief executive or the chief finance officer or whatever you might be, you have an important skill set and set of experience, but your capacity to challenge what a technical expert is telling you is reasonably limited. That's not your area of expertise. You need an equivalent area of expertise to be doing that questioning and challenge. And arguably, you might not need as much in the way of independent expertise and advisors to be brought in to make up for what you don't have because you have this centre. So that was my thinking behind this.
So NHS Scotland Assure may be part of the solution, but it might not be the totality of the solution for some of the issues you've just touched upon.
I don't believe it is the totality of the solution, no.
Thank you. Lord Brody, I'm conscious that that's just after 1 o'clock. I don't have much further to go, but I wouldn't be confident of finishing in the next 10 to 15 minutes, so that may be an appropriate point to take a break.
Yes, I can understand that, Mr. McGregor. We will take an hour for lunch, so if you could be back for about 2:05.
Yes, thank you.